Hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Steckline, partner for the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Today's presentation is going to feature some concepts from a recent white paper that we wrote. And that white paper came about as we were writing a paper on the Pracademic's Guide to Strategy Deployment, and we realized that it was leading into some other topic areas that we thought deserved to be documented and researched. And so today I'm going to share a little bit of information about this white paper that we've titled Side-by-Side Management. A few housekeeping details. We'll have the phones on mute. This webinar is being recorded for those that wish to listen to it later, share it with others. If you have questions, you can use the chat function while I'm presenting, and then we're going to unmute later on if anyone has any input, feedback. Input and feedback will be helpful as we've done some additional research on this topic, and the next version of the white paper is going to include some of the topics that are going to be presented today. So your input on the utility and usefulness of these concepts is going to be very helpful. Some things that we're going to be talking about today. At the top of this slide, you'll see the current bit.ly link to the side-by-side management paper, and I'm going to go through a few topics. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about what we call the evolving worldview of the new economic age. The basic foundation for the paper is presented in what I call new game, new rules, and new roles, and I'll be unpackaging that in a bit. I'll be talking about the role and the evolution of the hierarchy structure, which is one of the key concepts we're presenting in this paper, thus the term side-by-side management. And also, we're going to be getting into a bit of detail that we didn't get into in the white paper around knowledge creation and the importance of that and how that works and how a side-by-side view of management of the organization can help to facilitate that. And then wrapping up with new roles. What are the new roles? If you can believe that we are in a new game, new rules are required. What are those new roles? And then finally, a preview of some of the upcoming webinars that we're going to be presenting. So let's get into it. One of the white papers that we published is called The Evolving Worldview. And it features a concept that many people are probably familiar with, this view of an S-curve. You might call it a product life cycle curve. It's also a concept that applies to ideas. So early on, a new idea comes upon the environment. It's unproven, seems to be pretty radical, and the use is pretty low. Over time, however, the idea does gain more acceptance, becomes broader use, and we see more progress over time based upon the usefulness of that idea. However, problems start to surface that can't be solved by this new idea, and so something new is required. Thus, the cycle continues again, with new ideas being proposed, debated, talked about. One idea comes into use, becomes useful, and again the cycle continues. So how do we see this over time in human history? A lot of what I'm presenting here comes from the contributions of a terrific author, Sally Gerner, and others that talk about the evolution of human history and how people organize themselves. And early on, we know that if you look back in time, a way of organizing a group of people was called hunter-gatherer. And that worked for a period of time, but after a while, problems occurred that couldn't be solved by the hunter-gatherer model. So something new is required, and thus we saw the evolution and the beginning of the agricultural structure for organizing human social systems. And then something took that place, and we can see that the industrial or the machine age view, what Sally Gerner calls the clockwork view of the universe, came to be. And that's where we are right now. As a matter of fact, we're transitioning into a new idea. Sally calls this the integral or the system view of the organization, of the world, really. It's a world metaphor. And that red box, I'm just going to say in my thoughts here that we're right in the middle of that. There's evidence that the current problems that we have can't be solved by working harder at the industrial age model. And we're seeing the evolution over a period of decades of new thought leaders coming forth with what these new principles are going to be. So if you want to read more about that, you can go to this bit.ly link that outlines in a little more detail this evolving worldview, but I'm going to use this as a backdrop to our conversation today. So I mentioned new game, new rules, and new roles. So what does this mean? First of all, new game. If you believe that the prevailing world metaphor, the industrial metaphor, is no longer going to suffice, and we need to understand that there is a new game, we need to learn a little bit more about what that means. One of the people that strongly influenced my thinking and the thinking of many others is Dr. W. Edwards Deming. And I pulled this from his book, Out of the Crisis. Point number 2 of his 14 points, adopt the new philosophy. He says we're in a new economic age, and Western management must awaken to the challenge and learn their responsibilities, take on leadership for change. I knew Dr. Deming from roughly 1985 until he passed away in 1993, and I would write him letters, was before the age of email, and he would respond, and I can remember one particular question that I asked, and this was his response. He said it was sort of like getting a haiku response from him, a haiku poem. He said, survival's not compulsory and improvement's not compulsory, but improvement is necessary for survival. And I thought about that and what that means, and I place it back into this context, and I believe this is what he was talking about. If we're going to survive, if we're going to improve, we need to understand some of the new rules, and we need to understand that we are in a new game. If you looked at his 1993 book, The New Economics, the same pattern that Sally Gerner describes in her research, Dr. Deming pointed it out here, and this is what he was talking about when he mentioned transformation of management. That's what his whole life's work was about, was transformation of management. And this realization that we had to take on some new understanding, new knowledge, and we needed to think in an entirely different way about management, our work, our organizations. So let's think a little bit about what these new rules are. And you can find many sources on this. These are some topics from conversations with Dr. Deming and others. Some of the prevailing assumptions of the industrial worldview, contrasted with what are some of these new rules if you think about understanding the world and the organization as a system. So for instance, cause and effects are clearly known. Well, we know that that's really not the case. There's complexity, and it isn't always clear to find what the cause and effect is. Outcomes are constant. Well, we're learning that outcomes are variable. A big part of understanding variation is a point of that. Predictions are based on prescriptive theories. People will put forth recipes for success. Actually, we know that predictions are based on the empirical testing of these theories, and we cannot predict with certainty that something that we think worked will work in our situation. Every condition has a definitive answer. Well, we realize that in many situations there is no one definitive answer. Nothing comes forth as the right answer. Improvement comes from use of tools and methods. Not to say that tools and methods aren't important. However, we know that to predict with certainty that a tool or a method will work comes from the industrial view of the world, and we need to understand that those theories and methods and tools need to be tested in our system through what Dr. Deming and others call the PDSA cycle. Focus on extrinsic motivation or reliance on extrinsic motivation, either carrots or sticks. And then we're understanding that Humans are complex, and we need to understand and leverage intrinsic motivation. Now, the primary topic of this particular paper in today's discussion is really around this last set of rules on this paper, looking at prevailing style sees a few people at the top of the organization, a few thinkers and deciders, and the remaining people are the doers. A new view is coming forth, understanding that you need to think of the organization as a system. Everyone's a thinker, everyone's a doer, and we need to build ways to build knowledge and share knowledge throughout the organization. So this serves as a premise for the next few slides I'm going to go through. I want to talk a bit about the prevailing style, prevailing view of an organization. In nearly every organization I've been in, you can find some sort of an organizational chart that looks like this. As a matter of fact, if you go on the internet and ask to locate examples of organizational charts, it's a common picture. And you'll see, again, a few at the top and many at the bottom. There's something that's implicit here in this horizontal view, or rather this vertical view, that shows there's superior and subordinate. Again, people see themselves arranged according to a few at the top. Thinkers think and doers do is a term that we're starting to use in our work. So here's a little bit of history you may or may not be familiar with. Peter Schultes worked closely with Dr. Deming, outlined this material when he was alive, and he talked about the history of where did this structure of management come from, this organizational chart come from. And he described a train wreck that occurred in 1840s in Worcester, Massachusetts, near Worcester, Massachusetts. And there was a horrific crash. People were killed, many people were injured. It was sort of the shuttle disaster problem of the day. So to understand what was going on, you have to realize what was happening in industry at this time. Management as a function was really an unknown entity as organizations were moving from cottage industries. So as businesses grew, they needed a way to manage and think about management. They borrowed models primarily from the church and the military. And as a result of this train wreck, there was a commission appointed to look at the causes and make recommendations. Gentleman, retired general from West Point graduate, General Whistler, was leading the commission. And they came up with what was a chart that became known as a responsibility chart. Peter Schultes described it as a blame chart, which unfortunately was one of the causes. So the next time that a train wreck occurred, you would be able to find who was to blame. And so a big part of that vertical structure tends to focus on where's the causes and who is the cause of the problems that occur. So a little history there. Another person I'd like to feature in this discussion, and also featured in our paper, is a professor of mechanical engineering he wrote a book called Design in Nature. Adrian Bijan is his name. And he pointed out that the problem really isn't this hierarchy structure per se. It has to do with its orientation and the focus. So he studied this structure in nature. And for instance, here's a river delta. You see small inlets connected to larger streams, connected ultimately to a river. He studied and looked at structures in trees, both above the surface and below. You have one trunk leading to a few branches, leading to many twigs, and ultimately to the leaves. And then down below, looking at the root system. And he also looked at the human body, and you can see an image here of the lungs and the breathing system, the respiratory system, and how the one branch leads to a few branches, leads to many. And he understood that this was a common structure in nature, and it really is a necessary structure that helps to facilitate energy transfer. His specialty is in mechanical engineering, heat transfer, and he devised and understood what came to be known as a new law of physics called the constructal law of physics. And I really recommend his book, the Design in Nature book, to understand a little more about this. But he also pointed out that this isn't just in the natural systems, it's also in the social systems and our organizational systems. So I found this to be very pertinent. Also found this to be supported by Sally Gerner and others looking at this structure. Dr. Deming saw this in the 1950s as he was teaching Japanese leaders and engineers about his philosophy and what needed to be done. He shared this diagram of the organization as a system. And you can see that he saw the flow of information, the flow of work, and also the flow of research, what the customer needed, that fed into the design and redesign of the work. And it's a different view than that vertical hierarchy structure of an organization. Probably one of the first people to really define what the new view of an organization needed to look like. So I want to think about this evolution of the hierarchy model. And I want to pull on the contributions of another great author, Stanley McChrystal. General Stanley McChrystal wrote this book called Team of Teams, New Rules of Engagement for a Complex World, and couple this with the contributions of Adrian Bijan and Design of Nature. General McChrystal was one of the people that led the effort to redesign the military in response to new problems around the world and understand how the top-down view of the military needed to change. So he talked about the traditional command view and then how that evolves into a command of teams, and then ultimately what he calls a team of teams, moving then to that horizontal structure. And this is supported by Dr. Bijan, where he's described in his book that the constructal law predicts that this is going to happen, that new structures are going to emerge, again, going back to that S-curve concept. And it's also going to project that the rigidity of the hierarchy is going to give way to a freely morphing hierarchy. Perhaps you've heard the term of a self-organizing system. I believe this is what they are actually talking about. So going back to our S-curve concept, you can see that this structure will evolve to that structure and will again evolve into something with more of a horizontal view. It's a natural evolution about the way things are happening. Now, we can also apply the constructal law to the understanding and evolution of knowledge. All the great discoveries from Newton's laws of motion to the laws of thermodynamics, they didn't just come about. They organized and streamlined our knowledge. They replaced the bulky instruments with the principles that evolved, that serve as new channels in the hierarchy flow of knowledge and how things should be in nature. And we keep up with the steady flow of new information, lots of information coming all the time, through a process of simplification and replacement, so that empirical information, the things that we notice, the data we gather every day, the empirical models, are replaced by smaller summarizing statements, concepts, principles. In our work, what we call guiding principles. So now I want to turn the conversation over to two other thought leaders and connect this to knowledge creation, because that's where the conversation is turning. So a terrific book, The Knowledge Creating Company, Doctors Nonaka and Takeuchi describe how this occurs in Eastern companies and Western companies. So think in terms of Japanese companies and Western companies. I want to put this in the context of, so why is this important? Well, if you believe that in order to survive, and then going back to Dr. Deming's advice, Organizations need to do more than just simply bring in new information. They actually create this information, and it's created from the inside out. I want to make a few distinctions about the difference between knowledge and information before we get into this. Knowledge is about beliefs and commitment. It's about action and meaning. It's a dynamic human process justifying personal belief toward truth. Information provides a viewpoint for interpreting these events. It's a necessary medium. Both are necessary. And it affects knowledge by adding something new or structuring to it. So in their book, Nonaka and Takeuchi put this knowledge creating process along two dimensions. The first of all, called the epistemological dimension or theory of knowledge, and the other one on the ontological dimension, levels of knowledge. So what does that mean? Well, they described there's two types of knowledge that need to be understood. There's tacit knowledge, and then there's explicit knowledge. And along this continuum, there's knowledge at the individual level, at a group level, at an organizational level, and then at an intra-organizational level. So a spiral will emerge when there's this interaction between the tacit and the explicit knowledge is elevated dynamically from the lower level, again, to the individual level, to the inter-organizational level. So I'm going to unpackage this in a little bit more detail because I think it's important as we talk a little bit about really understanding this horizontal view of an organization. So knowledge can only be created by individuals, and it's up to an organization to support creative individuals and provides the context for them to create knowledge. In their book, the authors talk about 4 modes of knowledge conversion that are created when this tacit and explicit knowledge interact with each other. In our work, we talk about our work as pracademics, and we talk about the difference between, or the interaction between, the practical everyday world and the theory. And I think that's a lot about what's going on here. These 4 modes of knowledge are called socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization. It's the engine of knowledge creation. Thus, they came up with the acronym SECI to stand for these 4 areas. So these modes are what the individual experiences and the mechanisms by which individual gets articulated and amplified throughout the organization. Organizational knowledge is a process that amplifies the knowledge created by individuals. So, first of all, let's get some terms clear here. A distinction between tacit and explicit knowledge. So tacit knowledge is personal, it's context specific, and it's hard to formalize and communicate. Explicit knowledge, sometimes called codified knowledge, is transmittable in some sort of a systematic language. Tacit knowledge is knowledge of experience, it's knowledge of the body. It's described as subjective. Explicit knowledge is knowledge of rationality with our mind, described as objective. Tacit knowledge, also called simultaneous knowledge, refers to the here and now, in this moment. Explicit knowledge, think in terms of sequential knowledge. Think in terms of there and then. Tacit knowledge could also be considered analog knowledge, acquired through practice. And then explicit knowledge is digital knowledge, acquired through theory. So while Eastern cultures tend to emphasize the tacit knowledge, Western cultures tend to stress the explicit knowledge. Now these are not totally separate, tacit and explicit, but they're rather mutually complementary. Now I want to describe a little bit about these 4 modes of knowledge creation. What do we mean by socialization? This is the process of sharing experiences, creating tacit knowledge such as shared mental models and technical skills. So an individual can acquire tacit knowledge directly from others without even using a language. It could be through apprenticeship, observation, imitation, and the key to acquiring this knowledge is experience. So without some sort of a shared experience, it's difficult to bring yourself into someone else's thinking process. Externalization is a process articulating that tacit knowledge into explicit concepts. Often this is using metaphors and analogies, concepts, hypotheses, models. Externalization holds this key to knowledge creation because it creates new explicit concepts from the tacit knowledge. Combination is a process of systematizing these concepts into a knowledge system, combining different bodies of explicit knowledge. Knowledge creation shared out in formal education and training in schools is an example. In an organization, mid-level managers play a critical role in creating new concepts through network of codifying information and knowledge. The creative uses of computerized communication networks and large-scale databases facilitate this knowledge. At the top management level of the organization, or as we're going to be talking about in our model, to the left side, the integrated gets put into gradual concepts such as the corporate vision. If I just had to summarize it, I would say this webinar today and this white paper is an example of the combination mode. We're combining concepts from different thought leaders in different areas of knowledge. Finally, internalization is a process of embodying this explicit knowledge into tacit knowledge. It's closely related to learning by doing. So when experiences through the socialization, externalization, and combination are internalized into individuals' tacit knowledge bases through shared models, technical know-how, this is where it becomes valuable assets. This is where it becomes the differentiators for an organization. So if explicit knowledge is to become tacit, it helps if the knowledge is verbalized in diagrams, documents, manuals, oral stories. And this documentation helps individuals internalize what is experienced. Today's terminology may think about what standard work is. So this diagram adds the ontological dimension to the SECI, the tacit and explicit dimension from the previous slide. I'm placing this on a horizontal or the side-by-side view of the organization to anticipate where we're going in the direction of the central theme of this white paper and this presentation. So what does this mean? Well, the tacit knowledge of individuals is really the basis of organizational knowledge creation, individual experiences every day. The organization has to mobilize this tacit knowledge created and accumulated at the individual level for all individuals, and this mobilized tacit knowledge is amplified through these four modes of knowledge conversion. This is the knowledge spiral, which is the interaction between this tacit and explicit, again practical and theoretical, that becomes a larger scale as it moves up into the organization. Thus, organizational knowledge creation is a spiral process. It starts with every individual, moving through and expanding through these communities of interaction. It crosses sectional, departmental, division, organizational, and even inter-organizational boundaries. So let's connect this back to this idea of hierarchy. And what does this mean? If we think about this question, what is the most appropriate setting under which an organizational knowledge creation will flourish? What is the management process and system or structure? In other words, what really distinguishes a knowledge creating company? It has to be one that systematically manages the knowledge creation process. Now, there's a couple options available for this, and this again is outlined in the book by Nonaka and Takeuchi. First of all, top-down. I'll reiterate, the explicit assumption behind a top-down model is that there's a few people at the top that create the knowledge and they transfer that to the doers. Again, thinkers think, doers do. An alternative has been proposed and is discussed in many organizations called bottom-up. It's a mirror image of the top-down. So instead of hierarchy and division, there's a focus on autonomy. And instead of knowledge being created from the top, It's created at, and to a large extent, controlled from the bottom. In actuality, neither one of these is going to be very good at knowledge creation or conversion. It's not going to turn that spiral that is very important. So in their book, Tanaka and Takeuchi describe an alternative, what they call middle up down, where it's created by middle managers who are often leading a team or a task force, and is through this spiral conversion process involving both top and frontline employees. So I'm going to be getting into what's going to be working in the future in this systems view of the organization, and it's going to be much different, and it's going to have different roles that people are going to be playing in order to help to build and transfer this knowledge. So I've covered a lot of territory with that book, and I really recommend further study of that, and I've got a slide that lists some of the resources here. But now I want to transition this presentation to the contributions of another thought leader, Simon Sinek. In his book, Start With Why, he explains what he calls the golden circle, how great leaders are able to inspire action instead of trying to get action through manipulating people to act. Now, if you go to this bit.ly link on the slide, you can see a view of a TED Talk where Mr. Sinek discusses the golden circle concept. Well, here's how this communication typically works in most organizations. Every single company and organization on the planet knows what they do. This is true for large and small companies and every industry. Everyone can describe products and services the company sells. The what part is easy to identify. Some companies and people know how they do what they do, and how is often given to explain something is different or better. However, very few people or companies can articulate the why. Why do they do what they do? The why is not to make money. That's a result. Why answers the question of purpose. Why does your organization exist? Why do you get out of bed in the morning? Why should anyone care? So when most organizations or people think, act, or do something from the outside in, from the what to the why, and they do this for a good reason. They go from the thing that's the clearest then to the fuzziest. We say what we do. Sometimes we say how we do it, but we rarely say why we do what we do. Now in the video and also in the book, Mr. Sinek uses Apple computers as an example of a company that starts with the why. Now, if they were like every other company in the world, their communication would go something like this. We make great computers. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one? However, when they start with the why and switch the direction, the message is completely different. For instance, starting with the why. Everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. This is their why. Now to the what. At Apple, the way we challenge the status quo by making our products beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. And then finally, and we happen to make great computers. This is the why. What? Want to buy one? People don't buy what you do. They buy why you do it. So the golden circle is not just a communication tool. It provides some insight in how great organizations are organized. And if it's going to be of any real value, any practical value of how to build a great organization in our real world, it needs to be a three-dimensional. So the good news is that it is, as a matter of fact, you can look at it from the top down and you can convert it into a cone and then turn it on its side, and you can see its full value. It's leadership's roles and responsibilities to define and communicate the why. So you can see this picture starts to form what might begin to look like sort of a megaphone to communicate and translate purpose throughout the organization. For every great why-type person, there's an inspired how-type or a group of how-types that make the tangible cause and build the infrastructure that give it life. That infrastructure is what actually makes any measurable change or success in the organization possible. What we use in our language is who owns the systems that need to make this possible. The why of the what of an organization never changes, but what you do every day will change with the times. If all the things happening at the what level do not clearly represent why a company exists, then the ability to inspire is severely limited. So what I'd like to do now is get to the premise of how we start to view this and looking at the new roles and talking about what we're calling side-by-side management. So if you follow along and believe that the hierarchy structure by itself is not the problem, it's how it is used needs to be reconsidered, turning it 90 degrees to the left and think about what are the roles of leaders, what are the roles of managers, what are the roles of frontline, and ultimately, how do they all work together to serve the needs of the customers? Building on the concepts that we've talked about or outlined in the last few minutes, most recently with Simon Sinek, you can see how this would make sense, leading to from the why the company exists to the how things are translated from the why, and then ultimately to the what. And that interaction between the front line and the customers, the value creation process and the importance of that. So in our work, one of the latest visuals we're using has to do with summarizing what this means as far as the roles of leaders, managers, and frontline, and where people will, in the ideal state, be spending their time and focus. The upper left-hand triangle describes what you can think about as a strategic focus, thinking about the development of strategy and then the deployment of strategy. Leaders having the fundamental task here, transitioning that over to managers who play a role to translate and filter to the front line. And the front line has a role to play here as well. You can see the amount of time tapering, going from strong with leaders, about 50-50 with managers, and then some participation with the front line. It's all necessary. The triangle on the lower right, you can think of this as the daily management system or the operations system. This has to do with solving the problems of the day, whereas the previous triangle has to do with preparing the organization for the future or the problems of the future. So both of these parts of the system are important. Leaders will play a role in the daily management system, of course. They have to guide and direct and focus the work of managers and the focus of the front line. And there's another slice in the middle that we would describe as what is the standard work of everyone? Everyone has some level of standard work described as what's the current best way to get things done. So you can see a little bit more about this again in our white paper, side-by-side management. I want to end this part of the conversation and relate to another topic that we talk about in our model. We talk about the relationship between see, do, and get. So what does this mean? So how we see the model, how we see the world, our mental models, drives what we do. In other words, our behaviors. And what we do determines what we get, our outcomes. Those outcomes that we get will reinforce or challenge how we see the world, and the process continues in a cyclical manner. We wrote about this concept in our paper, True North, that you can get at that bit.ly link. But I want to relate this to what we've been talking about today with the structure of management, how we view this. So again, if we see the organization as a hierarchical structure, leaders at the top, a few at the bottom, many at the bottom, thinkers think, doers do, that's going to drive our behaviors. It's going to logically drive different kinds of behaviors that's going to determine the kind of outcomes we're going to get. Contrast that with this view of an organization. If we understand that there are different roles, however, everyone's working side by side together, that's going to drive different behaviors, which is going to get different outcomes. Thinking in terms of this structure here, if we build systems that look like this, where everyone's working together side by side, working toward the needs of those customers and working on the common purpose, that's going to drive different outcomes. It's our belief these are the kind of outcomes you get when you can think more in terms of a horizontal view or a side-by-side view of management. It's going to be increased trust, increased collaboration, not just knowledge creation, but knowledge sharing, better innovation, sustained improvement, and the kind of culture, everyday continuous improvement as merely as a way of being, not merely an event that occurs, but a way of being. So to sum up the premise of the paper and today's conversation, if we view this part of this view of the organization, what Peter Schultes described as the blame chart, or others have talked about command and control, it's different than looking at this view, which has to do with alignment and coaching. Rotating the organization chart 90 degrees counterclockwise is a first start to see the organization as a system and to see each other as partners on the journey, but more is required. It won't be sufficient just to turn the org chart on its side. People need to be treated with respect and feel that they're treated with respect, and leaders need to lead with humility. Those are some additional ads that need to be included on this if this is going to work. So I've listed many resources in the course of this presentation, and I'm going to relist them here. You can see some of them on this page. I highly recommend further study of these concepts. And I want to just close with a summary that what I've tried to describe is a realization that we are in a new game. This new game does require new rules, and there are new roles that need to be played. Now, I created a short little video that I'm going to put the bit.ly link here, but I'm also going to put this into the recording of today's presentation because it shows a little bottle puzzle that we use to explain these concepts and talk about the value of the side-by-side management view of the organization. So you can either go to the bit.ly link and go to that directly, but in the recording of today's webinar, I'm going to splice that and include it within the presentation.
This is Mike Steckline, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Today I wanted to share a little tool that we use to help explain some of the concepts of Institute for Enterprise Excellence models. And first I'd like to turn this over to the person I got the idea from, which is Tim Petrie. I'm going to share a short video where he describes this little puzzle, and then I'm going to go into a little more detail about how we use it to reinforce some of the concepts that we teach in our courses. So here's Tim.
This is something that I actually got as a Christmas present in 1998. And I was charged with going from one of our plants at Ford to another plant on the same site. One plant had just won the Shingo Prize. The other plant was all of the people who didn't want to go to this team-based environment were the ones that stayed in this plant. So they were wanting to work as individuals and honor seniority and everything. And so they had just negotiated a new modern operating agreement with the UAW to go to a team-based environment. The Ford production system was just being rolled out. So Cleveland Plant 1 or Plant 2 had actually helped develop the production system. Plant 1 was now being forced to adopt it, as all of the other Ford plants were. And the plant had just lost one engine line. The second engine line that was left, the production volumes were cut in half. And, oh, by the way, the plant is scheduled to close in 3 years. So my job was to go in and implement teams and implement the Ford production system in a plant that's closing and not in a very good mood. So we little bit of a challenge. So anyway, we started taking the same training processes and everything that we had used in the other plant, started bringing them over into this plant, and we were not being very successful. And the first thing that people said was, you're trying to implement this lean stuff, it's all about eliminating jobs. all you're trying to do is eliminate people. So I had gotten this, and it was weighing on my mind, how do I address this issue of lean being about getting rid of people? And I started bringing this to class with me and telling the story whenever things started getting out of hand. So the idea of this is that you have to try and get this ball that's in the bottom of the bottle into the top of the bottle to touch the cork. So the analogy is that if you look at the ball as being us, as people, as an organization, and we're currently in the present, and we're trying to get to the future. The neck of the bottle represents the future. There's this thing called the past that keeps getting in the way. So there's this rod. Okay. So the challenge is, how do you get out of the present into the future? So there's a couple things that you could do. So when you try and solve this, you can come in, you can try and shake things up, and it doesn't get you anywhere. Okay. You can try and turn things around, that doesn't get you anywhere. So what do you do? Well, if you think of this as a traditional organization structure, you've got a few people at the top making decisions, and you've got a lot of people at the bottom who are doing the work. So the idea is to take the people at the top, bring them down to where the work is being done, so that they can understand how their decisions are affecting people. Right? At the same time, you share information with the people who are doing the work, so that they can understand why decisions are being made and actually can start making some decisions themselves. So once you get people working at the same level, you still got this thing called the past. So you don't throw away the past. The past is what's gotten you to where you are. Ford at that time, plant had been in existence for over 50 years, had been very successful. You don't come in a change management thing and try and throw away the past. You build upon it. So you have to use the past. So there's a little notch on this bottle. And they've made this more difficult than the original one that I had. So it may not work as well. So you get the ball in the notch. You get everybody working at the same level. And then you go around and hold each other accountable by walking the gemba and seeing what's actually happening. And when you do that, you can get to the future. Now, the one thing that's constant about the present and the future is that the people are still there, and what's gone is all of the waste. So that's my story. So the good news is the plant stayed open. We were able to keep the plant open. They shut down for 2 years for retooling, but we were able to get a new engine program that came in. We were one of the first plants to achieve checkpoint A in the Ford production system, and the plant is currently building the EcoBoost engine for Ford, which is going into a lot of the new vehicles. So the future looks bright for that plant. So we saved about 600 jobs in the process, so it's very good. So all because of a little bottle.
The other method for solving the problem reinforces the idea of using a principle-based pathway for continuous improvement, and instead of making the counterclockwise pathway the program path, you can use the principles, and by getting the ball in the front groove of the puzzle, and if you turn the principle pathway, you can get to that desired future state.
So what I'd like to do is unmute the phones and find out if there's any questions or comments on what I've presented today. And I would be interested in your feedback and understanding the utility of this concept going forward. So I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions or comments. People are very courteous and quiet today. I'll then move on and talk about what's going to happen next. So the recording from today's webinar will get moved to this section of our website that you can find at this link. And again, I'm going to splice that one section in there on the puzzle bottle so you can learn about those concepts. And then some of the future webinars that we have. Next week, we will have the presentation from the leaders and clinicians at Hennepin County Medical Center. These folks were going to present in October, and the Joint Commission showed up and they weren't able to do that. So next Tuesday, they're going to be making this presentation. I'll actually be at their facility with them as they make their presentation. If you want to learn a little bit about what they're going to be sharing, go to that link on the lower right-hand side of this slide, and you can view a short video that describes some of the key points from their presentation. Friend and colleague Dan Markovitz is going to present on December the 8th some information highlighted in his book, Building the Fit Organization. I'm currently reading and rereading this book and find it to be very, very beneficial. I really like Dan's material. I highly recommend his other book, one of his other books, Factory of One, to people that want to better understand concepts such as daily management, leader standard work, and this idea of a Kanban system I find to be very helpful. And he's also terrific at helping people understand concepts such as the fallacy of multitasking. So looking forward to that presentation from Dan on December 8th. Go to that link at the bottom and you can view a short video that describes some of the things he's going to be talking about on December the 8th. January 26th, friend and colleague Kevin McNamara, who's the CEO at Tidy Products, is going to give a presentation on how he's experimented with and using leader standard work. So I've known Kevin for a couple years. I saw him present this information at a conference in August. Very helpful information, very beneficial perspective. We've had several people present on the topic of leader standard work, and there's always something new to learn. So Kevin's going to be sharing his experimentation, and it's going to be terrific hearing from a CEO that has been using and applying this concept in his work. Looking forward to that. There's a few topics in the works. Katie Anderson on the topic of daily intentional practice. The date and time for this presentation is yet to be determined, but Katie is going to be putting something together for us. And then Corrine and Melissa from Sandoval Regional Medical Center are going to co-present on some of the principle-driven learnings and topics that they've used at Sandoval Regional Medical Center in Rio Rancho, New Mexico. So looking forward to that. I'm always interested in learning from others and interested in hearing your stories and sharing your stories with others. I've got several other people that are interested in putting together presentations for 2018, and perhaps you could be one of those folks that would do that as well. So go to this link to join our LinkedIn group, but also send me an email if you've got a suggestion on a topic you'd like to hear, or if you have a story you'd like to share. We'd love to hear it. Thanks again for your time today, and I hope everyone has a good day and a good weekend, and we'll be talking to you again next week, Tuesday, when we hear from the folks at Hennepin County Medical Center. Thanks for your time today, folks.